Yeah, I record everything from the top in case in case the nectar flows. That's why I love recording, because it's not like a live stream where you know
True.
you have an audience, you have the audience pressing your own flow of conversation. But anyways, how have you been, man?
I'm doing.
No, I mean, how have you been? Like, just keeping it going.
Oh yeah. I've been really busy. I've been putting out a lot of content. I'm gonna trail off a little bit the last 2 weeks to December to take stock of things, take a bit of a break, and then go back to it in January.
Yeah, I feel like December's like the big time. December's always like, well, there's like Millennial and there's other things and there's but anyways, I never get to it. It'll be like an hour before I get to it. Introductions. So just give your blurb and what we're going to talk about today. So I'm sure a lot of my audience, sorry, someone, I'm getting distracted on my Telegram. Someone's asking me for the Carolyn Ellison erotica, but that was unfortunate. Did you catch the last Digital Archipelago where I Prude had to mute me because I kept reading it? So
no, I didn't.
I'll pin the weasel.
Wow.
Well, we could get to the FTX thing. I guess that's kind of pertinent. If these are the new aristocrats of our age. But anyways, Praise of Folly. Give us your quick CV, and also what we're going to talk about today. So
right, yeah. So I'm Praise of Folly from Praise of Folly podcast. You can follow me on Twitter, Telegram, Facebook. Also, you can support me on Locals, buy me a coffee, and subscribe star. Basically, what I do is I have a Monday, Tuesday show where I talk about whatever I want, a Wednesday show where I talk about church history, and a Saturday show where me and Logos, co-hosts of mine, are going through Mencius Moldbug's entire work, called Escaping the Moldbug Matrix. And today's discussion, I know the name of this podcast is called Content Minded. You're sort of a culture guy, art guy. One of the criticisms that many people in our sphere have is, why is art so bad? Why can't we get the kind of stories that we want anymore? And I feel the same way. And of course, Lewis and Tolkien felt the same way 80 years ago. So it's not a new problem. And I started thinking about, well, why is this the case? What can explain this malaise of art and culture?
Yes.
And I was looking at the 4 levels of simulation that Baudrillard in Simulacra and Simulation describes. And I realized that, coupled with an understanding of technology that Jacques Ellul provides, gives us an explanation for why culture is so bad right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so basically I was watching your video where you go into this about the nature of the simulation and culture and aesthetic production. I think that it's certainly interesting to see how the sort of like later iterations of postmodern thought, I mean, nowadays in academic philosophy, I mean, could you even say that there's a current moment the way that there was? I think 80s to 90s postmodernism was probably like the last gasp. But it's very interesting how the sort of like the ultimate, the apex of like French continental theory nowadays, I mean, gets blended in with, curmudgeon core analysis by people like Uncle Ted or Lash or, a lot of the situationists. It seems like this is a weird mix because on the one hand, I mean, the linguistification of reality that the postmodernists provided, or sort of like, the linguistic turn in philosophy also coincided with, I think, the linguistic turn in pretty much everywhere else in life. It seems that, but nowadays we're seeing, of course, in a strange way that everything becomes language. We're seeing this odd death of language, and that the image becomes the sort of supplicant for language. But I don't know, so how did you come to this observation? I mean, there's a lot there, But how would you like square the circle of saying that, you know, a postmodern thinker like Baudrillard could fit with someone like Ellul or Lewis Mumford or, you know, Uncle Ted?
Yeah. So the first thing is I read Simulacra and Simulation about a year ago, and prior to that, I was sort of because for me, this question of why is modern art, why is modern culture so bad, was a question that I've been wrestling with for well over a decade. And I was starting to realize that the stories that I liked, because they had good content, you know, good characters, developed characters, you know, complete story arcs, they all started to end around the late 19th, early 20th century.
Hmm.
And then they started the stories that I don't like, with the flat wooden characters, the contrived arcs, the bad kind of escapism, begins around the early 20th century. And I identified, from my point of view, so for example, Conan series and Kill the Conqueror with Howard, and then the Princess.
Yeah, that's really controversial with my audience. I mean, go
Yeah.
ahead. Well, let's go into your thing, but then please comment on why you hate Conan, because that's really I have a few friends that would probably try to track you down for that take. But
yeah, well, the other thing is, let me finish the point first, so they don't get into Conan. So the other one is Edgar Rice Burroughs, who did Tarzan and Princess of Mars. So
yeah,
that's the other. They all sort of are the first pulp action heroes. That's more or less what you call them. So I already mentioned escapism. So let's go back to an earlier point. Tolkien was accused of escapism by the cultural critics of his own day. And Lewis was accused of escapism as well. So the point for the works of Lewis and Tolkien, but specifically Narnia, can be found in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. At the very end, when Lucy and Edmund are told that they're too old to ever return to Narnia, Aslan says that I brought you to Narnia so that you might learn to know me here, so that you can serve me better in your world. Okay, so the kind of escapism that Lewis and Tolkien are trying to do is the kind of escapism, because they wouldn't have had the term clown world, but they were already beginning to see clown world, like, you know, Tolkien called the internal combustion engine a Mordor machine. And they're like, well, how do we, you know, preserve the truths and the values that we have? Well, we're going to have to tell stories that will expose them to new generations, which in this case are fantastical settings, right? There's orcs, there's dragons, there's witches, whatever, but they're there to bring new audiences to these older truths. But there's another kind of escapism where, like, you have the clown world and you want more of it, right? You can sort of see that, like, today with a lot of woke productions. They're like, reality is still too grounded for them. They need to have more disconnected, more unhinged. And so that's why I make the distinction between good and bad escapism. Good escapism says, yeah, clown world's bad, so we need to bring people back to concepts and ideas and stories that reflect what we all used to know. And then there's bad escapism, which says, well, no, we want more clown world. We want to dial this up all the way to, like, you know, BDSM sessions with furries, right? That's where we want to go. So, you know,
well, so the pup play guy in the U.S. military. I mean, that went viral recently, but it's like the fact that, like, kink become well, let's talk about that with the paywall version of it, but you know, that portion. But you know, it is funny that kink becomes this, like, acceptable norm, like it becomes the sort of the titillation of it is destroyed. I mean, this is what Baudrillard said as well in his, you know, is one essay which we can talk about. But anyways, yeah, sorry, cut you off, Grace. Go ahead.
Yeah, so then the question is, okay, well, why do I consider Howard and Burroughs bad escapism? Because if we look at the action hero in Pulp, and we see that ultimately nothing's at stake. Nobody's going to ever kill Conan. Nobody's going to ever kill Tarzan. No one's going to ever kill John Carter. And the reason why they win is because. It's just because, guys, because the author wants them to win. And so it removes all tension. It removes all suspense. If you cut a bloody trail like they do through people, you're going to have a bunch of angry relatives hounding you down to kill you. Now let's go back to another very violent story, the Iliad.
Mm.
You kill a bunch of people, it's going to catch up with you. And a lot of the heroes on the Greek side, even though they technically win, they come to bad ends because there's this cause and effect with what you do, right? So what Tolkien and Lewis are preserving is that if you do something, there's going to be a reaction to that. Could be good, could be bad, depending on the choice that you made. Whereas I would argue Pulp removes that. There's no, and all of modern fiction today that's bad is seeking to remove that. It's escaping from consequences. And
so you're saying that Conan was like the first pop culture iteration of like the female equivalent would be like the Mary Sue or like the Invincible.
Yes. Well,
and I guess
the first one would actually be John Carter, Princess of Mars. But yeah, it's the
No, but what about high literature at the time, like the turn of the 20th century, like with the 20th century novel, like Toni Morrison or Wyndham Lewis or I mean, even like the modern ones nowadays. I mean, who reads novels anymore, right? Like, I mean, I guess people still read Franzen and they'll read God Rest His Soul, David Foster Wallace, or like even like in the 20th century, like the late 20th century, you had the new journalist people, like you had Tom Wolfe, who else am I thinking of? The one that wrote Cold Blood. Oh yeah, Capote. I mean, at that time, but you're more focusing on like what is mass appeal, pop culture, like what people like the mass, what most people have like their aesthetic picture of like what.
Well, more of the point is where do these ideas start? So I'm not saying that the 20th century. I love Lord of the Rings.
Norman Mailer, that's what was the tip of my tongue. Norman Mailer, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I love Lord of the Rings. I love Narnia. There is still good literature in the 20th century. That's not the argument I'm making, but that the kind of trends that we will now recognize today, like say Ray in episode 7, Mary Sue, all of these trends that we hate and dislike on the right. And even, just normies that are just want something sane and rational again. I think that these ideas are kind of starting all in the early 20th century with Pulp. And then it goes into radio, it goes into all these other avenues. Hollywood does its own thing. Part of it is media limitation. Obviously, books are different. You can tell complex stories in a book, but radio and movies less so. So the medium does put constraints. That's why adapting a book into a movie always means you have to lose something because there's a limitation in the form of the moving picture. And so, but I'm sort of getting sidetracked. You asked me, how did I get to Baudrillard? Well, I'm like, there's got to be something that ties all this together because I was sort of groping towards this point. And I remember hearing about Baudrillard probably from The Matrix because I know he was mentioned in there, at least tacitly.
Yeah, even he hated The Matrix though.
He hated it, yeah. So I finally looked him up and I watched some videos of people talking about him, and I'm like, this might be the kind of guy that ties everything together for me. And then when I read Simulacra on Simulation, I realized that it did. And okay, then the next question was, how does this tie into the sort of like text skepticism of Uncle Ted and someone like Jacques Ellul and others? And I think the way that it ties in is that his underlying critique of the simulation is a sort of critique of capitalism, which again is popular with French philosophy.
Yeah.
But here's the thing, though. What Ellul tells us, though, is that what capitalism and communism have in common is more than what they have in difference. This slavish service to technique, and when you realize that Baudrillard is not, he's not going far enough. He's looking at the capitalist commodification structure, but it's like you can go deeper because what he dislikes about capitalism, you're also going to dislike about communism,
right?
And then that just digs even deeper until you get to Uncle Ted, is what I would say.
Well, I think because with Uncle Ted, you have the sort of technique itself becomes the source of one's own motivations and one's own pursuits, and how technology has a weird ideological. I mean, Mumford said this. that technology has a weird ideological facet to it where its own furtherance and progress becomes the sum total of human existence. But then on the back end, the classic Ted Kaczynskian point of it atrophies your natural abilities, but more than that, it supplants you with pseudo identifications and pseudo events and pseudo, what did he call it?
The power process?
Yeah, the power process, but also he called it pseudo what do they call it? Pseudo pursuits or something like that. Like basically false goals and false pursuits.
Yeah.
Yeah, is it pseudo? Yeah, I know pseudo identification is one, but there's also there's another word for it. But yeah, so I guess Baudrillard is essentially making a point, but about a specific manifestation of how communicative technology has manifested to the point where all of life becomes consumed in its wake. And it's not that, like, again, like I agree with Sam Chris's critique of the Matrix. Like, he was commenting on the new one. Like, I didn't see the new one, but I heard it's terrible. Like, it's got like a lot of woke garbage, and it's got like a lot of self-awareness, which always destroys a franchise when it's too self-aware, especially that nature of like that theory fiction stuff. But he said that the Matrix essentially concretizes the whole pursuit of like what Baudrillard, like it concretizes the whole picture of what a simulation is. It's saying that you're like in a matrix and you're a human battery, and it's like it gives a form, a materialistic form to it. Whereas Baudrillard, he hated the Matrix because he's saying it's not like this chud brain like Black Mirror, the technology bad, or the Matrix, I'm not reliving the real life, I'm in Plato's cave. It's like the first year philosophy stuff, when they write essays about the Matrix and the Plato's cave. It's more of like you can't tell the difference between what is narrative being and what is the real. That's the whole point. Like, it's not saying like you gotta escape the Plato's cave. Like, it's just I'm doing like the when Trump did the hands and people like roasted him for it, like I don't understand. Like, I gotta stop doing that. I'm gonna anyways. I know it's very offensive, but go ahead, Praise. Go ahead. I'm sorry, I'm just rambling right now.
No, that's okay. But you brought up Trump, so I have to bring up the snake. Do you remember the snake poem?
Yeah, but the snake was the best part of Trump. I mean, that was, when he said it, it was like a rock star, or it was like a well-timed, performance piece where he's like, shut up, silly woman. And when the snake scowled with a grin, you should have known, you knew damn well I was a snake. And then when he would say, when you let me in, and the crowd would just like go nuts. Like that was,
yeah,
it was about immigrants. So that was pretty based. But anyways, we were going to say about Trump. Yeah.
No, yeah, that was all I wanted to say about Trump. But Trump's
the creature of the simulation, but that's
for sure.
Pretty old take, but
that's for sure. But so this is two things. So one, I think it might be helpful to briefly find and overview the four levels of simulation.
Right.
The first level of simulation is an attempt to accurately reproduce something real. The second order of simulation is an attempt to hide what's there. The third order is to hide what's not there. The fourth order makes reference to nothing at all, which he calls hyperreality, which means it refers only to itself.
Right.
And so I would argue that really the Ukraine war is sort of the first hyper
blue yellow. I'm paranoid about the YouTube.
Oh, right.
I think you could say Ukraine. Yeah. Anyways, yeah. Blue yellow.
Yeah. It's it's the first hyper real war, but this is, I think, pertinent to your concerns of culture. I think that there's four. Okay. Well, first of all, I think we need to define culture, and you can tell me if you agree with this. Culture can be defined in one of two senses, right? A living organic body of people. We must be like a culture of bacteria or a culture of people. They're living together in this organic group, and then
it's influenced by many things. Yeah, like their location, their temperament, their national character, blah blah blah. Yeah,
and then there's cultural artifacts, which are those things they create: music, literature, paintings, etc.
Diseases.
Yeah. So I'll call culture the sort of living together of these people, and cultural artifacts the things that they produce that we don't see anymore that we want to see. The dissident right and many other people have seemed to think that you start by producing the cultural artifacts.
Mhm.
You don't. The cultural artifacts themselves are the product of an already existing culture. Somebody might say,
Right.
well, didn't Lewis and Tolkien do that? Yeah, but they're edge cases, right? They're good.
No, but I was gonna say they produced from material that was already present within European civilization
Yeah.
to begin with. So
Yeah,
yeah.
and so that's the other way, right? If you can't experience it directly, like they couldn't, you can experience it indirectly through the literature of Western civilization.
Right.
And so when I say culture artifacts are quote good culture artifacts, when they are the expression of such an embodied lived existence among a people,
Mm.
and bad cultural artifacts are those that are not. So how does Baudrillard tie into this? Well, the bad culture we have today is the product of third and fourth level simulations, which is not the product of lived, rooted experiences like, say, the Divine Comedy was.
Right.
And I think that goes a long way in explaining in an actual, practical fashion what the problem is here. So let me give you an example. Growing up, what got me started on my I'm old enough to remember when Age of Empires Rise of Rome was a new game, 1997. I loved Age of Empires growing up, and so I got involved into history. I'd call that probably a first order simulation. It's trying to be kind of real, but it's also trying to be fun. And I thought, man, with computer technology, we're going to get amazing games 20 years out. And 20 years out, the games are garbage. They're a hot mess. And it's like, wait a minute. Why don't we have these really cool simulation games that are like Antiquity or the Middle Ages, like the two Age of Empires 1 and 2 games? Well, part of it is the simulation grows and expands. People's contact with reality or real cultures is diminished. And so they lack the very creative ideas to produce it. Unless they were to read the books, which they don't, they can only make reference to other simulations.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this process of only making reference to other simulations that makes modern cultural artifacts so bad.
Well, I think, yeah, I think politics operates this way as well. So for example, yeah, I did this essay many years ago. Not many years ago. I shouldn't say it, but it seems like since 2016, time has accelerated during the Trumpian and post-Trumpian era, TCE, if you will. It seems that time has sped up, and it's I do you remember when Ready Player One came out? Was that 2019 or 2018? No, this must have been 2017, 2018.
No, I don't.
Yeah, this is gonna bother me. This is really going to bother. Let me just quickly. I wrote this essay for for Thermidor magazine way back then, so it must have been 2017, and I had to endure the actually going to the cinema with my two best friends, and we were like, okay, this is going to be terrible, but we're doing it. Oh, 2018, there you go. It was the last year Thermidor was around. So I wrote this review of it about like how it's the ultimate movie of the postmodern condition because it's essentially like Spielbergo. Um, see again, I'm doing it right now. I made that reference from the early Simpsons. Like I swear to God, if I made a wrong turn in life, if I discovered I don't know, if I discovered like Kropotkin as opposed to like Julius Evola, I could have been an irony leftist because I could have been a Chapo dirtbag. Because like think of it, I love early Simpsons references, Sopranos references. I could have been that, but anyways, thank God. Anyways, so Ready Player One was like the ultimate Spielbergo. Like I'm referencing all of this cultural ephemera, like mostly from pop culture cinema, and the whole film is constitutive of just a very high tech overlay to film like Hollywood referencing itself over and over again. And really, it's like the distinction becomes a language onto its own. Like you point to, you know, and there's moments in it like you could just point to, oh, that's the room, the red room in The Shining. Oh, that's E.T. Oh, that's, you know, whatever. Like think of like whatever big blockbuster Spielberg produced. Like name
Yeah.
me some. I can even forget now. What's a big
There's
Spielberg
Jurassic
block?
Park, right?
Jurassic Park. Yeah, Jurassic Park was there. He did Jurassic Park.
I think that was Spielberg. Yeah.
I Again, this is bothering me now. Let's see. Let's go through the list. So this guy's more creative than Spielberg. That's another Sopranos you know, Johnny Sack reference. Indiana Jones was there. He did Columbo. I didn't know he did Columbo. He did the color. Oh, he did the color purple. That was the creepy scene where Whoopi is. You know, never mind. Yeah, Saving Private Ryan, War of the Worlds, West Side Story. Man, Spielberg like really is the cultural egregore of like the American empire. You really see it. You know what I mean? So. So anyways, Ready Player One was like sort of this love fest for whatever like DreamWorks or whatever, you know, big budget anime, you know, studio work, like whether it be Jurassic Park or you know, Tintin, Lincoln, you know, you name it, right? Like it's I don't think they reference Schindler's List for obvious reasons. But it's so but when you have this panacea of pop culture that only refers to itself, then all of life and politics becomes a so
the reason in part why this is happening is because as you know, industrial civilization rolls out and separates people further and further from themselves. A really good short story that anybody should read is E.M. Forster's The Machine Stops. This guy in 1909 is predicting the internet and people living in pods. It's really eerie. And he talks about he basically could foresee the kind of insane living conditions that we have now. And now we don't really have any contact with each other even, right? Let alone something real. So part of the problem, so let's go look at Star Wars Episode 7, right? The one that everybody loves to hate on, because it is a hyper-real hot mess. It only refers to Star Wars. And you can argue plausibly that there is some malevolence involved here, but if we look at the actual people doing the creating, these are probably millennials, right? And these are people that don't know what happened before 1945 or maybe even before 1990. Let's be honest. They don't know what happened before 1990.
Well, what happened in 1945, that becomes narrativized and that becomes the mythos that drives the modern world. But yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
And so they're operating from only what they know, right? And they live in this sort of like mechanical womb of the machine, and they don't know anything else. So in some sense, you can say, yeah, there's malevolence. But in another sense, given the kind of people we're talking about who are successful in Hollywood, who make it to this level to work on Episode 7, they don't know anything else. And they themselves are the result of this broader process of simulation construction that unless somebody was to be really, you know, self-motivated to start reading books again, you know, good luck with that demographic. Then yeah, you're just not going to know. So part of it is, you could say, malevolent, but I think part of it is just this sort of like force of history.
Right. Yeah, but I mean that's like but when you're looking at it, because I do want to go back to Conan, because that's like a huge, like, I mean, my friend, we'll get to it, but when it comes to like the force of history and the development of civilization in terms of techniques, or what I'd like to call in the digital age, like hyper techniques, you know, a lot of work from like Byung-Chul Han, for instance, it's always like, is this the ultimate black pill, like say from a dissident perspective, or any dissident, not just like the right wing, but we mostly mean the right wing because that's what we're part of. But like, let's say even if you're a communist or whatever, if you're some kind of like anachronistic ideologue from a bygone era, is it a black pill that the development of civilization, like in some ways proves like the Fukuyama, like Whig history thesis of like, well, civilization is always going to develop like this, and there's no stopping the force of history, and you got to be on the right side of history, blah, blah, blah. Even though, you know, how can you be on the right side of history when history's ending, which is kind of curious. But let's say like that, argument is that basically if you're especially a right-wing dissident, that you have no place here and that actually you're fighting against history itself and so forth. But
Right. Well, okay. So in that sense, I think looking at the cosmic picture, if you will, of where we stand in this process is, I think this is more of a Lovecraftian point. The idea that there's this inevitable decay that eventually starts to rot out. Because remember, let's go back to the very, very first chapter of Simulacra and Simulation. The hyperreal simulation collapses. He makes reference to the Borgia map, which is more real than the map of Italy itself. But eventually what happens is through the process of copying, it gets further and further removed from what's real, which then leads to its own dissolution into what he calls the desert of the real.
right.
And so I actually think that if we're in the hyperreal phase, there's a small ray of hope, because that means the collapse into the desert of the real isn't too far off.
And for those who don't know, define the desert of but I would say that it's like, cyclical history in all of its forms has, especially for the past, I would say 20 years, has influenced right-wing thought more than anything. So, I mean, but then the question is, like, is that an elaborate cope to say that, well, history is cyclical, or rather, Turbo America or the Turbo Empire and Turbo Liberalism is here to stay? I mean, we could talk about that, but just before we get to that, define for people what is the desert of the real in Baudrillard's
Right.
lingo.
So the desert of the real is the idea where it's called a desert because it's not a part of the map. Okay,
Right.
so the map is decaying, and that part where there's a hole now in the map, that's a desert, and what the map is collapsing back into is the real,
Right.
that it was itself a copy of. Because you what ends up happening is there ends up becoming the struggle between the copy trying to assert its dominance over what's real.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a struggle that will fail because it has no independent existence. Its existence is still dependent on the real, even if it would dilute itself into hyperreality.
It's a phantasm of the real. It derives its whole essence from the real. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so then how does this collapse, like in Baudrillard's equation? It's been a long time since I read Simulacra and Simulation, but like he talks about like not the Iraq War, the Gulf War, the first one. That's where he used the term desert of the real. How and it's funny because like the Wachowski sisters, quote unquote, they use that to justify their own like trans ideology, that the real, that is the desert, is like actually, well, the Matrix is telling you, well, actually you should take these funny pills and all the rest I can't say for YouTube purposes. So but how does the desert finally reach a crescendo where the map experiences, like, I guess you would say, a zone of indeterminacy, where there's sort of the map collapses in on itself? Like how does it desertify, like that process, like in the Amazon, when you chop away the rainforest because of all the fauna was at the very top of the soil, right? Like that all the nutrients and rainwater get sucked up by the plant life that has been growing for thousands of years. And when you strip that away, then it desertifies and the soil is loose. Like how does like culture itself desertify? How do we go back to the real,
right?
Which is a barren wasteland, by the way.
The other big idea from the first chapter of Simulacra and Simulation is he couches the terms of the simulations within the context of the debate between the iconodules and iconoclasts in the Eastern Roman Empire in the Middle Ages. Can you have images representing God and divine things, or can you not? And so that's the sort of backdrop for where he then expresses this thought. And he says that when you get to the hyper-reality of God in the sort of multitudinous images of God and temples and images and sculptures and paintings, he says that at that point, you get atheism, because people then begin to wonder, was there ever even a God to begin with that these images represented? Because they're so disassociated. And he said at that point, he uses a technical term, volatilize, which means to turn into a gas. The idea of God turns into a gas, and then he says you have the epiphany of power.
So, like when chlorine turns into a gas, it becomes volatile and it diffuses. Yeah.
So I think what he's saying here, right, is as a sort of like motive cause. When hyperreality becomes dominant, it it volatilizes itself into a gas. And so, and that happens in part because it's so disconnected from the real. So it's almost like when people on the right talk about the collapse of the Soviet Union, they like to point to internal contradictions. There was inevitable internal contradictions. And I think what Baudrillard is saying is that the collapse of hyperreality is in some sense inevitable because of internal contradictions.
Yeah. Well, it depends, because there's a certain faction of the right, like matured positions that, like, well, maybe the Soviet Union was based, but Stalin got rid of anyways. And of course nowadays with the current conflict, I mean, that's a big shelling point on the political right, like the ones that support the blue yellow and the ones that don't, the ones, yeah. But anyways, that's just maybe we'll talk about that. I don't know what your opinion is on it, but like, anyways, we could get to that in the paywall version of it. So it's but I think the metaphor of a sort of diffusion through volatility and desertification is a good one. So, like, I don't know if Baudrillard meant it this way, but say, like, all of hyperreality, all of like the what culture is, that's sort of like the megafauna that is at the top of the layer of the soil and the sedimentary, apparatus and the trees and so forth, the way it is in the rainforest. Very diverse species of things that grow over many years that don't tend to replicate very well. That's why when you cut a lot of these species away, it's not very good, right? It's not like in the North America is, flora and fauna in North America, has evolved to be little in number, but yet very easy to reproduce, pine trees, for instance. So when you cut away that, the real is like sort of the desertified soil, the soil that's lacking nutrients, because all of that was sucked up by the simulated overlayer, by the sort of whatever you want to call it, culture, simulation, so forth. And so when you strip away that simulation, I mean, this is if, say, for example, the sort of various cultural apparatuses in the Western world, if that, because of, bad economic conditions or so forth, or I don't know, maybe we'll enact based world and we'll overthrow the Hollywood overlords. If by some dramatic event, sort of the major production of most cultural institutions were to wither away, what will be left of the real? Like, according to Baudrillard, according to even your analysis, like in your analysis, like, what do you feel would be stripped away from people and what would be left? Like, I mean, we all have this fantasy of destroying the media and destroying Hollywood and destroying, the satanic whole infotainment apparatus. But then what are we going to replace it with? Or what will be left if, that glorious cleansing fire were to happen of, whatever that means. I mean nothing. I'm liberal, as Bap would say. I mean nothing by it. I'm not Fed posting, but yeah, go ahead.
So the first question is, what would be left? Not much. Not much would be left. I think what you're describing is a moment of primal Lovecraftian horror for most people.
Right.
Once
if they never made another Marvel film, right?
Yeah. But and so, there's a whole lot of ways we could explore how they would react to that. But what would replace it would be what replaced it before. You'd see oral traditions starting up again. You'd see those that could still write books would begin writing books again. They probably wouldn't be very good. It'd take a long time to get back to Shakespeare, but they'd get started. We'd probably have music again, actual bands, people playing together, maybe in small communal settings before they go to large.
More of a minstrel type setting, yeah.
Yeah, minstrel. Yeah, exactly. You could see that again. You might even see the return of bards, right? People that can recite whole stories from memory in a lyrical form.
And it wouldn't just be a hipster cafe thing.
No,
it would be
it'd be real. Yeah, it'd be real. The guy could just go over the country and get, paid to sing, right? So something like that. And so these are the kinds of things that I think we could see replace. And of course, what then would be the subject matter of these narrative art forms? Well, initially, people's lived experiences in the hollowed out husk of this. So it would be it would be without precedent in history, because they would be writing about the end of a system that is unparalleled in history. And so you would it would have forms and structures that would look familiar to people of the ancient past, but the
Right.
subject matter would be utterly foreign to them.
Yeah, yeah. But that's what I mean, like, what is an event, like, how does it eventually go back to the real in Baudrillard's analysis, and how can we do this in our own lifetime? Not that, I mean, what is we? Um, I mean, we're relatively powerless compared to these like
Right.
massive culture industry institutions. But it's like, what does Baudrillard say? Like, what is the inevitable outcome? Because there's no like real like Hegelianism in a lot of Baudrillard and a lot of
Yeah.
these postmodernist thinkers. So this sort of like a never-ending cycle. But then some people say that Hegel was kind of like a never-ending cycle. But Baudrillard, he has a very funny relationship to Hegel, but just that's too complex. That's too complex for our discussion. But maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe like, is there a dialectic in Baudrillard? Like, is there a moment where the desertification actually happens? Yeah.
Right. I think I've only read Simulacra and Simulation, so any of other Baudrillard's work I've not read. And in that
Well,
book,
Vital Illusion, he goes into this a little bit, but yeah.
so in that book, he's only really describing the simulation itself. He's not talking about before it, and he's not talking about after it. He's
Yeah.
talking about the simulation itself. And as far as if he talks about the after somewhere else, I haven't read that, so I couldn't comment on his opinion. Now, what I would think would be, I mean, one obvious way this whole all falls apart is, international supply chain disruption and energy shortages. I mean, not.
Right.
I guess we could, get into the tangent about Europe's impending energy crisis, but I mean, if you get to a point where the energy crisis is catastrophic, then all this edutainment just goes away because there's no power. I mean, when the electricity goes off, Hollywood shuts down.
Right. Right.
That would be like the doomsday scenario, but that's one possible way, because ultimately whatever happens, right? The operative factor by which hyperreality collapses is that there are events happening on the ground that it is not reacting to appropriately. So perfect case is the U.S. defeat in Afghanistan. The U.S. lost the Taliban because the Taliban was operating in the real world, making real world decisions, while the United States was making these paranoid, delusional decisions in some sort of like fourth dimension or whatever.
It reminds you of the current conflict as we speak.
Exactly. Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
And so the question is,
wholesome Chungus nationalism compelling them to like lose troops by the thousands every month, the blue yellow side, because it's like we have to hold on to every little inch, and because the media propaganda around it will be so strong, and the fact, like, which is a failure, I would say, of the Kremlin, in that they really have to rely on they literally have to rely on like Vatnik Telegram channels and like Strelkov memes to like give them their propaganda boost. Like they're just terrible at it, because they're never going to compete with like these glow in the dark institutions that have influenced Hollywood and the media.
no.
And we do know that 3 other agencies have influenced the media. I mean, the Twitter files has pretty much proved it. But anyways, go ahead, Praise. Yeah, sorry.
Oh yeah, no, yeah, I agree. And so I think ultimately what will cause, and it could be any number of events, but there will be events that are happening on the ground that either are not being accounted for because, according to the woke gospel, they don't exist, or if they do exist, they're going to be treated in the wrong way because of the way they're viewed, rather than the way they ought to be treated, because from having a grounded, real world look at it. So
yeah,
I think ultimately just the fact that you become, it was somebody in the Bush administration in the Iraq War said that we create our own reality. That's what's going to bring this whole thing down.
Yeah. Yeah, the unknown unknowns, I think, was one of the brilliant phrases by a very, very evil man, but nevertheless Rumsfeld. So it's almost as if I mean, even Baudrillard talks about this in like Fatal Theories, right? Like it's but I was trying to look up when it comes to Baudrillard's notion of disappearance as opposed to Hegel and like absolute spirit. Let's quote from Baudrillard right now. So this is from, I believe this is from Simulacra and Simulation. So he says that today abstraction is no longer no. So this is from the essay, the procession of simulation, which I believe was in the book. Today abstraction is no longer that of the map, the double, the mirror, the concept. Simulation is no longer that of territory, a referential being, a substance. It is the generation by a models of a real without origin, a reality, a hyperreality. The territory no longer precedes the map. So that's the famous saying. It is all, so skipping forward, it is all metaphysics that is lost. No more mirror of being an appearance of the real and of concept. No more imaginary coextensivity. It is general miniaturization that is the dimension of simulation. The real is produced from miniaturized cells, matrices, and memory banks, models of control. It can be reproduced an infinite number of times from these. It no longer needs to be rational because it no longer measures itself against either an ideal or a negative instance. It is no longer anything but operational. In fact, it is no longer really the real because no imaginary envelops it anymore. It is hyperreality, produced from radiating synthesis of combinatorial models, hyperdimensional space with atmosphere. Then he says that the modern world foreseen by Marx, blah, blah, blah. Soon there will no longer be any thoughts, senses, surfaces of confrontation, any suspension of thought between the illusion and the real. So in other words, there will be no doubt whether something is a production or something is real. And we see this with like real life events and LARPing and how even news stories are basically not real. I mean, they're real in the sense that they are facticities of something, but they are not real in the sense of them being like the actual news. It's like when reporters and journalists try to make the news, like if you're some hideous Taylor Lorenz creature, then then it's like that's not good. But in other words, he's saying that the lattices of he's saying that in other words, metaphysics are gone because there's no longer any overarching structure of the difference between, let's say, Platonic forms, there being a higher level of reality and the real being something that is a copy. Rather, there's just an infinite series of copies and it's eminentized. And in the sense, there's no even higher purpose to why technology and the simulation itself in pop culture and so forth, there's no real logic to it in the sense that there is no overarching value of why these things exist or why they're propagated. I mean, there is like progressive, like cathedral, like I tend to avoid the term cathedral because I think that it's not really the scope of, and of course, Molebug is cringe nowadays. But we'll get to Molebug even. But let's call them like global American empire institutions or like woke moralism. Like those things have a logic to it, but Baudrillard is saying the way that they operate, the way that culture and the simulation operates, there really is just no logic to it besides its own propagation. There is no higher principle guiding it. Therefore, we exist in like these little micro worlds, but also the way in which it is propagated no longer comes from centralized sources, but comes from servers and memory banks, and it comes from sort of these like little microplanets of meta contagions, really. Like they propagate, they spread forth, they're like memes, they're packets of information. There's no longer a cultural or a civilizational central hub to it. There's no mass or gravity. It becomes eminentized. It's everywhere at once. You know what I mean? So that's I think is what the price of what the world that we're living in. So wait, let me just go back to it for a second. So no longer any need to be rational because it no longer measures itself against an ideal or negative instance. So it's kind of like what Byung-Chul Han says about dataism. It's like data becomes the only thing that matters. It's not like really, there's no logic to it. It's just like there's no shared upon agreement of what constitutes value and why we're mining data. Data becomes the god. It becomes the sort of monolith from 2001. Data is everything because data is also nothing at the same time, because there is nothing that instantiates the collection of data. It's like, why do we collect data? Oh, because we can monitor people more effectively. Why do we monitor people? It's like, oh, well, the managerial state has its own logic. But where does that logic come from? To who benefits from that? Oh, I guess all of humanity. But really saying all of humanity in this like one total state, it's like that doesn't mean anything really, because there's no value of like that particular civilization It's like, why is this governing body operating the way it does? Why does it need to collect data? It's like, oh, well, we have to collect data in the whole world. But why? It's like, well, I don't know why. Like, it's like, well, I guess that's the way history manifests itself. It's like, that's the Kojevian answer. But you know what I mean, Praise of Folly? It's like, there's no logic to it anymore. It's like, why are we doing this? Oh, I don't know. Why does there have to be a Marvel movie every year? Oh, I don't know. Like, why does Hollywood need to exist anymore if it doesn't speak to the heart?
Why does the movie Wag the Dog have to be occurring in Eastern Europe right now?
Yeah, well, there you go. Like, it's, but no, you know what?
Yeah,
like what he means by the desertification of everything. Yeah,
yeah. There's no reason for why the system does what it does now. It's sort of like lashing out in its death rattles, is what it looks like.
Right. But no, but comment on that passage from the Baudrillard's essay.
Yeah. Well,
the lack of metaphysics, in other words, that's another interesting topic.
Well, first of all, this explains the rise of the new atheist movement in the late 90s, right? Because they were sort of a social expression of this technical material reality. And again, if you were to ask them why, they couldn't. It just is, right? They were just a cultural expression of this reality. And with the hyperreal, which is basically, you've described the in very detailed terms, the hyperreality, it refers only to itself because it seeks to define itself with regards to nothing but itself. But it itself is nothing, right? So that's what you said. It's nothing. And so
it's like a Borjas paradox room, you know?
Well, yeah. Well, the thing about this, right? We see this a lot with men in the business world or in the military. They're always about, well, we have this project we have to finish, and they never think to ask, why am I doing this project? Why does this project matter? It's just nope, got to do the project.
The GDP, though, the GDP. That's why.
GDP. Well, I mean, Afghanistan is a good example, right? You have a lot of these, sandbox bros, and they're like, got to do the mission. Why? Because we just got to do the mission. And then the whole mission was a waste. We lost in Afghanistan, and they never thought to ask the question, can we actually win this mission?
Right.
Its very existence creates, it doesn't need an argument anymore, right? Because it exists.
And exactly. Yeah.
It doesn't
exist, therefore, yeah.
It exists, therefore serve my needs, right? It doesn't need an argument anymore because it's hegemonic. And so we see a lot of bizarre behavior that people have because, again, they're sort of conditioned not to think why they do something, because in the public life, they're just there to do what the machine wants, the simulation wants them to do. And so, if you ask somebody, why do you play video games all day? Or why do you, waste your time all day? It's like, well, why not? Like, there's no reason anymore.
Maybe they're the true aristocrats, though. They're breaking the system. This is what Agamben says, that you just have to disengage, really. That's the only option you have, realistically.
Absolutely.
Unless you want to Fed post. But then it's like, I don't say you should smoke weed and play video games all day, but there is something to be said about the way in which certain palliatives or pseudo activities, the way that they can capture you. For example, there was this moment in the early 90s or the late 90s to the 2000s where you had a lot of shut-ins. They would play Second Life, and that would be their online world, because the real reality is sort of they're not very engaged for obvious reasons, whether because of disability or poverty or social eccentricity. I mean, there's a variety of reasons why the online mass worlds were very popular and still are. I mean, I'm sure Second Life is still going, although it's not it doesn't capture the cultural imagination the way it did in 2002. But I'm saying and I'm reading this author who is, me and Catherine D, we were going to talk about her. Her name was Humdog on the internet. And she was she was really a pioneer of writing about the internet. and about like online life, you know, and unfortunately she sunsetted in 2008 for a variety of reasons. But you know, so it's very interesting. And she was also on Second Life, and you know, had this weird BDSM relationship there, the Gorian thing. If you remember that, like it's really interesting how the escape of life to the online is something. But that's, you know, another topic. But sticking with your example with the Iraq and Afghanistan war, Afghanistan more so, you really think of it, there was no reason to it. I mean, okay, what I mean is that there was a lot of like geopolitical architecture that went into, even from like the 80s and 90s. You had thinkers like Zbigniew Brzezinski that said, well, you know, you have to control this region because the Chinese are going to build the pipeline, the Northern Pipeline. That's bad. And that's going to challenge American hegemony. So therefore, you have to basically occupy Afghanistan forever. But as time went on, the usual logic of empires fades away because we don't live in a real empire. We sort of do, but we don't. We live in this hyperreal empire. And so the benefits conferred to the average, for example, American citizen or coalition of the willing, right? The average Canadian or British or French. Were the French there?
No, they were not a part of the willing, at least not initially.
No, yeah, but I know the Canadians and the French were there in Afghanistan, but not Iraq. We opted out of Iraq because of Kretchen, which I think was a good move. I mean, he really saw. I mean, you gotta give it to Kretchen. You know, I mean, as much as he was a corrupt Liberal Party PM. I mean, well, he was. I mean, Kretchen was. I mean, God, he was a philosopher king compared to Trudeau nowadays. But you know. But anyways, Kretchen got us out of Iraq, but then we went to Afghanistan. But the logic of the war during the Obama years was like, okay, we're there because of humanitarian reasons, because of, women's rights or whatever. But that wasn't really, that was terrible. It was no longer this like neocon Christian LARPing, which a lot of them weren't even Christians, right? They were, never mind. Right? The neocons. But a lot of it was the rhetoric that was being fed to George Bush by hideous schools like David Frum, where they would say, like, this is a crusade, this is the clash of civilization, Samuel P. Huntington's vindicated, the Christian society has to go there and like body all of these Muslims because they're threatening our, they hate us for our freedom though. And that was the seed. It wasn't they hate us because we're Christian, they hate us because of our freedom. And then that becomes, they hate us because of women and trans rights, right? So, but then that becomes another sort of second order of the illusion of the simulation, because now it's like, where do those humanitarian principles come from? Do they come from Christianity? No, they don't. They come from Western civilization. Well, not really. They come from the UN Charter of Universal Human Rights, blah, blah, blah. It's like, because it comes from the civil rights regime that's then spread throughout the world, right? This is the Caldwell analysis. But when it comes to the illusion of Afghanistan, it really didn't benefit the American people whatsoever, apart from a bunch of soldiers that have PTSD that unfortunately, more of them are casualties of being taken out by their own hand, if you know what I mean, than actual war deaths in Afghanistan. It didn't benefit us in terms of the oil or in terms of controlling the region, because the Chinese are going to build the pipeline anyways, right? Because the Taliban have cut deals with them, the Talachads. And it didn't benefit and it didn't benefit us in terms of fighting global radicalization, because really that was all just like a creation of them to begin with during, the 80s with the Mujahideen. So it's like none of it mattered. It's like, why were we there for 20 years? Was it global policing? Oh, not really, because we really care about these people. Because if we were an actual empire, North America in general, because I include Canada in this because basically we're just like an American vassal state and a Chinese vassal state as well. So it's like, it didn't, like, a real true imperial power would essentially create like a complex mineral mine reserve and vacation place in Afghanistan, like, the Roman Empire. When it came to the resources, we didn't really build a lot of those mines that were subservient to American corporations. You know what I mean? Like what are we doing? What are we doing there? Nothing. And it was it's very interesting how even more than the Gulf War, which Baudrillard was talking about, Afghanistan was sort of like the ultimate simulation of warfare. It's like, why are we there? Oh, I don't know. It's like, I guess we're there. Are we fighting the Taliban? No, I mean, they're kind of like the Taliban, but they're kind of not. It's like, oh, okay. It's like,
well, it's worse than that too, right? Because don't you remember
right now? But yeah, go ahead.
No, it's worse than that. Because don't you remember that in 2001, the Taliban actually offered to give Osama bin Laden up.
That's right. Yes, because he fell out of favor. Yeah.
The loophole that Bush was standing on, they were going to give Osama bin Laden up to independent international third parties in order to pass judgment on him, whereas the United States wanted him to be delivered to the United States directly, which is a meaningless technicality because who runs all the NGOs? It's the United States. Like
exactly.
It's
the rules-based order.
it's so the whole thing was just so nonsense. And this is something else too with hyperreality. We all remember, going back to right before Trump announces his run for presidency.
He went down the elevator. Yeah.
The thing is, we're always left scratching our heads, at the next absurdity that's coming down the pipeline. And I think this is something that I think we can take to the bank. Once you achieve hyperreality, all possibilities become equally probable because nobody's taking, no crazy shooter is going to take stock and be like, is this really going to achieve the goal that I want? They're in hyperreality now. That's not even a consideration that they even think about. So,
it's almost like mass casualty events have gone beyond ideology now in some ways. Yeah. I mean, not really. I mean, there's still ideologically driven ones, but it's almost as if the spectacle of like they've always become a homostratus, right? Like that the Greek myth, where it's essentially becomes like a metaphor for doing crimes to become famous. Like it's funny because that was that line in Stalker by Tarkovsky where he's like, "Oh God," like it was the professor, his supervisor. And he said to him, "Oh God, you're not even a homostratus. It's like you just want to punish me, by finding the room."
Well, and so see, because what Trump did was he sort of tapped into this hyper reality that was beyond politics, and they're like, "What do we do to this guy? We can't stop him. He's untouchable. He's operating at a higher level than the rest of us," and he just like swept the field. So what he showed is that anybody else who can tap into this cultural hyper reality can just do an end run around the political system, sweep it through, which then is what Baudrillard calls the epiphany of power. So one of the things that the simulation has to do, or the machine, if you want to call it that, is as we, with each new set of material conditions, we have a new set of social realities that go along with it. Because that's how you mesh together. And so the reason why we had, as you said, these programs in the late 90s, early 2000s that had, quote, right-wing messages and left-wing conclusions was a part of this cultural process of stripping down old ways of thinking, old ways of acting, and then reconstructing it in a way that it would fit nicely into this new system.
Right. Yeah. Like, I mean, even to use, like, again, I went from like, well, I mean, they of course hate each other. I mentioned Joel, but now I'll mention Academic Agent. How he has like the Boomer Truth regime?
Mm-hmm.
Well, like Tony Soprano embodies a lot of aspects of that. There's this video I did on it actually, where, for example, when they did the Columbus Day Parade episode, where Silvio, he organized with Carlo, like, and Patsy, like they organized, like, they're like, we're Italian Americans and we belong to the Italian American Defamation League, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, we have to defend our culture and heritage that Columbus represents. And they get into the fight with the indigenous people demonstrating against Columbus. And it's an embarrassment, but then they're driving and Silvio is talking about this, and then Tony just bursts out like, group, what group? You know, what happened to Gabby Koopa? The strong silent type. Like, in other words, he's saying that like typical deracinated boomer that came from, you know, largely European immigrants, he's like, in this case, Italian immigrants, he's like, you know, what group? Like, we're Americans, you know, we're no longer, in other words, our ethnos no longer matters because it's all about like the good of like, well, in his case, the mafia, like the good of production, the good of like being a boomer materialist that lives in America rather than lives in the consciousness of the old world, which what Silvio wants, you know, because with Tony, like Tony, you know, he only spoke a little bit of Italian. He only went to Italy once when he was older. Like he, you know, he wasn't really connected to the roots of his people the way that others were in the series, like Silvio. Like, you know, so it's like the boomer truth regime is like, yeah, it's good to like LARP as your ethnicity, to say like, I'm Italian and, you know, it's a Columbus Day. And I go to the, you know, in Queens, they got in, you know, New York, New Jersey, the big, you know, they have the St. Mary's Festival, right? Like it's like, but when it comes down to it, you're an American that makes money. That's what it really matters. So yeah.
No, yeah. And so, but
I don't just want to talk about that or The Simpsons. Yeah, but go ahead. Yeah.
Well, no, I was just going to say that a lot of these quote edgy, or whether it's the comedy skits of Dave Chappelle, whether it's The Simpsons, whether it's The Sopranos, there's this right wing element is where America was at the time, and it had to be deconstructed and then repackaged into this new left wing product. And so this is part of the expansion of the simulation as a way to explain these cultural artifacts. And the reason why you can't go back, right, is because the conditions that allowed them to exist in the first place are gone.
Right.
So you can't go back. You have to just keep moving forward now, it seems.
But what can break like the Cthulhu swims leftward? And eventually I want to talk about Moldbug and your critiques of him. I know you're going through this whole thing, but I specifically want to talk about like Curtis Yarvin, like as he is nowadays. But how do you break the cycle? Is it just that you have to let things fail? You have to let people become so disinterested with pop culture and like the culture industry in general that like the real will eventually have its revenge on the simulated? Like what is, you were talking about this with what's his name, Oros?
Oros Post, yeah.
Yeah, Oros Post. You were talking about him, like how do you escape the simulation? Like you were saying, like if you had this good example of someone in Africa where it's like if you live in Lagos, maybe you're closer to it. If you live in like, you know, Nairobi, you're closer to it. Certainly if you live in Johannesburg, you're closer to it. But if you live in like the bush still of like Swaziland, you're not close to it unless you have like Starlink. I don't know. Like how, like you were saying, like how do you separate yourself from like, I guess the simulation could be what a lot of people call like the global American empire.
Yeah.
Or they call other things and other 3-letter things that probably I can't mention. You know, like it's like, how do you escape then? Or is there escape impossible? And it's rather just accentuating the contradictions, as the situationists used to say, you know, like, what is the strategy here that you're outlining?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously some form of accelerationism is a strategy, but I think that this is the real, I think, question for all of us in this time. So in The Lord of the Rings, you know, Frodo says, I wish the ring hadn't come to me. And then Gandalf says, you know, if you, it's in the movie. If you've read the books, it's there too. You know, it's not for us to decide, but what to do with the time that's given us, right? We all wish we weren't alive at the end of the GAE, but we are. So going back to Uncle Ted, you made this, there's a distinction between real meaningful actions, which he calls the power process, which are real activities that are meaningful, that engage with the world and other people. And then there are these pseudo actions that we do because we feel powerless, because, you know, because the machine wants us to. What we need to do is we need to figure out, and this is going to be hard for a lot of people because, again, we're separated from the past, is identify what are these pseudo actions and what are real actions, and then sort of imagine this desert of the real being like the final exam test, and it's like you gotta do all your studying before the final exam test. And so rather than cramming, you start your midterms, you start preparing, and by the time you get to the final exam test, you're ready to go. You got it because you've been preparing. You in addition to your normal course load work, you know what you have to do to pass this final exam test, and you're doing both at the same time. You're doing your normal work to maintain your position in school, and then you're also budgeting for a little bit at a time, preparing for your final exam. So we all got to do stuff to get by in life, which, whether that's a real event or not is beyond our decisions in most cases. But discretionary time that we have, we can decide, instead of doing these like pseudo things, watch movies, play video games, whatever, waste time surfing on the internet, whatever. Begin doing things that are real, that will be useful some point in the future. Like, reading books, for example, to learn how to think differently, how to relate differently, how to escape this prison of our minds. If all we have were simulations after 1945 to relate to the past, we would not know anything about the past. It'd be a prison, and the only way to escape that prison is to actually read about it. Now, this is about culture, so we'd have to read culture. Read Homer, read Shakespeare, read real stuff, so that you can begin to think and act in a way. See, because the reason why so many people, as Uncle Ted points out, gets sucked into these pseudo actions is they ultimately don't know better. They don't know what a real action would look like, an action that is goal oriented to something intrinsic to them in the real world. And figuring out how you could do that is like the first hurdle, and it's a big one. They were organizing in order to provide mundane services to people that the coalition forces were not providing.
And a lot of these old hats, they had experience, and they knew from their training in the 80s what to do. And of course, when they took over Afghanistan in the 90s, they already knew everything, how to do it. So
Hezbollah does the same thing in Lebanon, right?
Hezbollah is even more of a sophisticated example, but yeah.
And so what's missing right now is people who are dissidents, who the real exploit here is, as the services that are being offered by the GAE either get too expensive or break down or don't work anymore, there will be a demand for that. And those dissidents of whatever persuasion who can most quickly realize this and provide their own alternative for these services will be very successful.
But my point being is that you have people on the ground who have marketable skills, who are computer people, who are programmers, who are just average, nuts and bolts working class people. Why is it not imperative that the right wing should make cancel-proof economies like mutual trust societies? Now, there are people that are doing this. My good friend Bennett Demelich, who is a Mormon, is doing a Mormon version of it with his exit thing. And of course, he got that from Nick Land, the title. But he's saying, after he got doxxed, and of course he's a man who has a wife and, multiple children, right? He's got a family. But, if you're a Mormon, they help you out, it didn't impact him the way that they thought it would be. Because, a lot of people in the Mormon church, they're based and they help each other out. And why can't we have those networks that are basically anti-fragile to the greater whole of society that wants to destroy us? Why is it not we're creating these things?
Yeah. No, that's the meat space activity that needs to happen, not the LARP, not the 2017 LARP.
Exactly. Yeah. We sort of break up into our micro groups and our micro tribes, and they no longer have a sort of huge omnipresent metastructure that holds everything together. Okay, when the boomers die, that's it, Anyways, go ahead.
I got it, Gio. You asked what happens. What happens is gypsies versus hippies.
Whoa. What do you mean by that?
Oh, was a reference. No, that was a reference to one of your early streams with Prudentialist.
Oh yeah. Yeah. But who would be the gypsies in that equation?
No, I'm just joking. I'm making a lore reference.
Oh, you're not saying it's like gonna be like the dark elves versus
No,
hobbits.
I'm making an inside joke.
No, but okay, it's an inside joke, but when you really think of it, would the Zoomer leftoids be like the gypsies of the modern world? And we would be like the neo-hippie, like reactionaries who are like staging these, like, because a lot of people have equated like Trumpism with like a neo-hippie movement.
Huh.
And like they say that like when creepy Brandon is sort of like when the hippies woke up in 71 and Richard Nixon was president. It's like, oh man, I guess we got to go to grad school now. Like it's
Wow. No, I don't. It will be. There won't be this consensus anymore, right? I think
right.
what's really holding America together and the Western world is this boomer consensus. And as long as the boomers are alive, because they have the money and the status and the position, they're using all their effort to keep the frame where it was in 1990, and it's not working. And when they get, like you said, pill it off, I think what's going to happen is there's going to be a massive acceleration of trends. The trends that we're observing now are being artificially suppressed by the boomers, and when the boomers are gone, there won't be anybody in their place to stifle. Well, I'll give you a real tangible.
Maybe Gen Xers, but go ahead.
They're outnumbered by millennials and Zoomers, though.
Oh, that's right. But yet they have a lot of capital, though.
They do, but how many of them will be able to actually unite all the capital back together?
True.
That's the question.
Yeah.
No, but I'll give you a very real hands-on example. So in like, say, the Mississippi River or the Ohio River, there's basically dedicated, traffic controllers that make sure these barges don't hit each other. Most of them, or for a power plant, both coal and nuclear, you have all of these boomer technicians that are vital to make sure that these technique processes continue apace.
Yeah.
When they're gone, nobody's got that specialized knowledge anymore. Like,
right.
It's gone. They didn't pass it on to anybody.
Well, they could theoretically.
But they won't. We know they won't.
But I don't know. Does the internet complicate? Like, does data recording complicate this? Like, can we experience another like Library of Alexandria moment? Or
no, you mean where like it gets lost?
Well, it gets totally lost, but like another like I shouldn't even say the Dark Ages because the Dark Ages weren't really dark, but like
I know what you mean. Yeah,
like a mass loss of information. Yeah,
we could. Yeah.
Interesting, because that's what I mean. Like, would the internet and would these systems that we have in place prevent it? But then at the same time, there was an interesting article I was reading by this NFT guy that does this Y2K thing, where he's saying like we think that the old phrase that came from when we were kids. Roughly we're millennials. You're an older millennial. I'm like a core millennial. But he, the phrase that we were taught when we were growing up was when you put it on the internet, it's there forever. But really, is it there forever? Because there's whole archives and there's dead sites and there's like, sites that have been cut off by the Google algorithm. And there's archives of like Usenet forums and mud sites and, what was the big one called? The Well. Do you remember The Well?
I don't.
Well was like the first chat room, like uniting chat room thing, discussion board. And so like I think The Well is still around. Like you have to pay for membership, but only like, old boomers are on The Well. Now in the age of social media, those things are irrelevant, but like, there's still people in forums. But the point being is that a lot of them are lost to the sands of time. Very few things are preserved. There are like GeoCities.
Oh, do you remember Zanga?
Yeah, Zanga. Yeah.
It's gone. It's all gone.
Well, same with my mother was a pioneer that she was in the AOL chat rooms, Yahoo chat, like her and my uncle, like it's like all that stuff's gone. MSN Messenger, those chat logs.
Yeah.
When we shared Billy Talent songs, like that's gone. Like that's what I mean. Like the whole notion that it's there forever on the internet is not true. archives get wiped by the internet collectively updating.
Well,
What's Web 3.0 or whatever. Yeah.
Another thing that happens is if you have like a online like blog or news site, and you update to like new commenting software, it wipes out all the old comments.
Yeah, that's right. Remember when everyone updated to Discus?
Yeah.
Yeah, like that was.
Yeah.
Then all the news sites just got rid of comment sections because of like they couldn't handle it anymore. Or things change. Like for example, since the late 90s, like the top conservative news aggregate site that had the most traffic was Drudge Report.
Mhm.
But then Trump broke his brain, and nobody goes to Drudge Report anymore. So, there you go, Matt Drubs. He sold his soul. It's very funny how the savior of the right wing on Twitter is like essentially like a transhumanist, like that, that wants to sink us into Neuralink. But I don't know. I think Elon, he's secretly, how I know he's secretly based?
How?
Because he's a pro-natalist. Because he said this in an interview. He said, well, the pleasure of reproduction is just incredible compared to like, the birth control. And it's like, so I'm like, I heard that. I'm like, wow, he's based because he values
life.
Yes. He's a cream pie nationalist, essentially. So,
okay.
Yeah, no, he said this, and it's like, that's how I know he's based. I use that joke way too often. I gotta stop. But anyways, to read from Virilio. This is Aesthetics of Disappearance. He's talking about the evolution of the movie house and the cities, how they mimic each other, and how the cities sort of disappear. He says that a projection room where they try to compensate for the monotony of the trip. So he's talking about travel by attraction of the image, festival of ethereal crossing, aerial crossing, transitory deurbanization, where nomadic micropoles replace a sedentary metropolis, and where the world flown over offers nothing further of interest, to the point where the supersonic subliminal comforts demand the world's total occlusion, in anticipation probably of the next phase, flight in darkness and necrosis of the passengers. The question today, therefore, so he's talking about how cinema invades, like, traveling, right, on planes. Mm-hmm. He says that flight in darkness, necrosis of the passengers. The question today, therefore, is no longer known if cinema can do without a place, but if places can do without cinema. Urbanism is in decline. Architecture is in the constant motion and movement, while dwellings have become no more than amorphosis of thresholds, meaning the non-places. And how, like, what do you do in your domicile? What do you do in your dwelling? You consume media. And so the dwelling loses its significance because you're always plugged into this global brain, whether it be the internet or the culture industry or so forth. And then he says, in spite of people's nostalgia about the history about Rome is no longer Rome, architecture no longer is architecture, but in geometry, the space-time of vectors, the aesthetics of construction is dissimulated in the special effects of the communication mechanisms and machines, engines of transfer and transmission. The arts continue to disappear in the intense illumination of projection and diffusion. After the age of architecture, sculpture, we now are in the time of cinematographic factitiousness, literally a well of figuratively. From now, no architecture is only a movie. An uninhabited motility is successor to the inhabitude of the city, becoming an immense darkroom for the fascination of the mobs, where light of vehicle speed, audio, visual, automotive renews the glare of solar light. So in other words, he's saying that the way that we experience the city and the way that we experience architecture is essentially just the way we experience cinema.
No,
so for
yeah.
So go ahead.
It's rooted from any sort of referent, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So can we say that the French philosophers of the 20th century get the MVP? We have Baudrillard, Virilo, and Ellul.
Yeah. Exactly. Like, so it's something that Kino Corner said to me, where he said, like, the way that people experience architecture is through cinema, in that people will go to tourist traps that are essentially like, wow, this mall was filmed in this movie. This place and location was in this movie, this blockbuster. It's like architecture, the experience of going to a place is now instantiated by that simulated world
Yep.
of cinema. And now the fact that we can carry that with us means that when we travel, it's more of traveling to the simulation rather than traveling, for example, um, the Baroque cathedral in Spain, right? It's no longer about that. Yeah, yeah. So
Absolutely.
but then how do we like go back to cinema? I mean, how do we go back to architecture? How do we go back to location and dwelling? Like that's what Heidegger says as well. Like,
Mhm.
dwelling disappears in the non-place. How do we destroy the non-place? I mean, there's a lot of people in the
Mhm.
in the art world that talk about this, like how you can utilize public space to like re-territorialize it to like the needs of like locality or significance. Like what is dwelling? Dwelling is the significance that you place upon a location based on the culture and the existence that you have within it, right? You build it,
Mhm.
the dwelling, you dwell within it, to Heidegger. So how do you take a non-place that is in the public, that is internationalized? Because for example, whole countries are non-places, like here in Canada, right? Like we're
Mhm.
basically the country that is a non-place. How do you then recapture it for the service of dwelling? That is the question. How do you break free of this?
Yeah, I think ultimately, and this is something I've been saying a lot on other platforms like my channel, is that
Yeah,
there. I understand the difficulty that this entails, but the next step after communicating online, which is again a very important first step, don't get me
right.
wrong, people that think like this need to find a place where they can start moving to live together, because
Yeah, yeah,
that's how you the unplace becomes a place when people live there. and
exactly.
and
Yes.
so yeah, there's people in the UK, people in Canada, people in America, people in Australia. Yeah, I know, all over. I get it, it's not going to be easy, but that, I think, is where the question needs to go. How? Because if you talk to anybody online, they're going to say, IRL, I'm alone, I can't show my face. You just mentioned that today. You can't do stuff because everybody knows you'll get shut down. And it's like, well, we need to get to a point where there's a place where we don't have to worry about that.
Yeah, yeah. But that's the thing. Like, it's just it, it seems impossible though, because we're
Yeah.
living in this time where we are separated by location, geography. Like a lot of my friends are in the UK, a lot of my friends are in America. Long distance relationships, it tends to like, they're not material until you need a meet space, I
Yeah.
feel. A
Well,
lot
yeah,
of these,
exactly.
you know what I mean?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I guess unless we have a miracle where the boomers pull their collective heads out of their collective asses and use their vast amounts of wealth to buy land and start a compound, yeah, it's going to be hard.
One that's not going to get Waco'd. Uh
Well,
there's
sure, but we
yeah.
have examples of that are less extreme that
Oh yeah. Yeah.
have worked out as these like parallel.
So
Well,
do we need like Paris Commune, but like based right wing version of
yeah,
it? Like
yeah, that's what we mean. Yeah,
the right wing influencer house.
yeah,
I said this once on Twitter. I said that what would a right wing influencer house look like podcasters, and people were like, either will have like the highest murder rate, or people were just posting pictures of like Mount Carmel of Waco. So like,
mm,
or someone posted a picture of Jonestown.
ouch.
But no, but I know what you mean. Like it is like it seems that needs to like square the circle for the online right. We just need to move next to each other. We just need to like do some kind of like Auroville where no, that's not fed posting. I'm not fed posting, but the
There's these cause and effect. If you do this, this will happen to you. Whereas there never seems to be any sort of consequences to what Conan does. Even Ulysses, who has a happy ending, still case in point, he also has hubris. He tells the Cyclops, not content to have escaped Polyphemus by blinding him, he has to rub it in and tell him who did it. And of course, the Cyclops is the son of Poseidon, who then asks Poseidon to curse Ulysses, and he wanders for 10 years. So actions have consequences. There's lessons.
Wait, you mean Ulysses? Do you mean Odysseus? Or,
yeah, the same guy.
Okay. Yeah, because that was the whole point that Horkheimer and Adorno made about how reason was always blended in with myth, and like how the Odyssey is a good example, because how he blinds the Cyclops and he said, "What's your name?" The Cyclops asks him what his name is. He's like, "I'm nobody." And then he went back to the Titans, to the gods. And he's like, "Who did this to you?" He's like, "Oh, nobody did this to me."
yeah. But so that all has this like level of real, even though it is, told in this mythic form, it's a kind of like a Lewisian or Tolkien-esque escapism. It teaches you real lessons. Reading these, for lack of a better word, power fantasies from, Howard or Burroughs. You know what it is? You know what it is? Hot take of the year. It's resentment. Nietzsche says that resentment is the feeling that you have when you want to strike out at your oppressor, but you can't because you're impotent.
Wow.
Resentment leads to power fantasy.
Yeah. And so you think the right wing is just filled with resentment?
Well,
like bro literature, like Travis Bickle, Ryan Gosling characters.
Well, I'll just say that Edgar Rice Burroughs and Howard are expressing in their archetypes. They appeal to Nietzschean resentment to sell books.
But yet they would say that these are Nietzsche. This is Nietzschean literature. This is up there with Celine and Mishima and Younger, and like I don't know. It's like Pulp is very interesting because it has to be very salient and very streamlined and very, like, it's appealing to the male fantasy, obviously, but I don't know where I'm going with this. I think that, like, for example, Horkheimer and Adorno, right? Horkdorno, as I call them. In the Dialect of Enlightenment, they talk about how reason permeates myth, and they were always co-communal with each other. So, for example, the Iliad is a good illustration, or rather, the Odyssey is a good illustration, both of them, of the overturning of that Greek mythic order by basically human reason tricking the gods in a lot of circumstances. And so that is a demonstration of, like, well, reason and myth, it's dialectical rather than a linear time sequence of, well, we were mythic, superstitious people that were in the Dark Ages, man. And then we all of a sudden discovered science and reason, and boom, it's like the Enlightenment. It's like that's the Richard Dawkins take of history. But really, myth and reason were always together, even in the Iliad. And in the Odyssey, especially, you have instances of like humans tricking gods, which, that doesn't make any sense, especially, to the logic of Christianity. That doesn't make any sense in terms of like how can we trick God, right? Like, it's like, oh, that doesn't make any sense. But in the ancient world, in a lot of these pagan traditions, that happened all the time. Like the gods had just as much of a, they had just as much of a debaucherous spirit as the humans they ruled over. In many instances. I mean, you have to go into Zeus and the golden shower, and anyways, no, but so yeah, that's just. But when it comes to like the modern, like, pop culture pantheon of heroes, it's almost as if that, nuance of logic that disappears.
Yes.
Now, yeah, that's what you're trying to say.
It does, because if you were to say, okay, well, there's also this idea of like fate or doom, right? So as you're reading the Iliad, especially with Hector, because he's the one that actually dies in the story, but even Achilles, right? Because there's a prophecy that he will be killed by Paris. This is all going according to a broader script. Like, it's almost like they've chosen certain courses that will lead to certain conclusions, which is their death. Now, because it's a war, these are warriors. Of course, that's what you're going to expect, right?
Right.
That sense of circumspection or abstraction doesn't really seem to be present with, what was it, John Carter or Tarzan, where it's just like, well, they're going to win because the author wants them to win. The other thing too is there's this sense in which the author seeks to create ever more elaborate and strange situations for the hero to deal with, because
Yeah, this is like The Walking Dead. Yeah, that keeps going on forever. Yeah,
it's kind of
Daryl's never gonna die. Michonne's never gonna die.
Yeah,
Rick won't even die. But anyways, yeah, go ahead. Yeah,
yeah, and the reason why there's this propagation of ever novel experiences for the hero is it's really, it's that strive for novelty and ennui, which is the result of ennui and a decadent civilization, because
right.
novelty in itself isn't an end. Novelty can be useful, but there's like this built-in, because again, with this like pulp serialization, it's just novelty for the sake of novelty, and you eventually begin to realize, well, wait a minute, this can't possibly all be happening to the same guy. Like, that's not how one man's life would work.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. A lot of these like action heroes, and or even like just like spy thrillers or cop dramas, or it's like I was watching with my folks. I was watching this this Australian cop drama called Blue Heelers, where it's like this little town in like near Melbourne, and it's like all this crime and murder and like drug dealing and like all this stuff happens to this little town in Australia. And it's funny because the Wikipedia page, or rather the fan wiki page, said that it's like the murder capital of Australia. It's like the crime capital of Australia. It's like little like 2,000 people village in like near, on the outskirts of Melbourne. It's like, what? Like it's really, you have to turn your mind off when it comes to it. Yeah.
And so to amuse, right, means to not think. Muse means to think. Amuse means to not think. The Iliad, okay, because again, I have to compare the Iliad to this because it's the same kind of like, for lack of a better word, action hero. It's Achilles, it's Diomedes, it's Ulysses, versus the John Carter, Conan and Tarzan. It's the pulp is to amuse. You can only enjoy it when you're not really thinking too much about it.
Right.
Whereas if you read the Iliad or the Odyssey and then you think about it, you actually enjoy it more, because you begin to see what Homer was getting at. And it's that fundamental disconnect that I think is where we end up ultimately from a Gary Sue like John Carter to a Mary Sue like Ray.
Oh, that's what they call it, Gary Sues?
Yeah, they're called Gary Sues.
Oh my God. There you go. That's a good term for it. But like, is Conan a Gary Sue?
I think so. I mean, do we ever see? I mean, granted, I only read like the first three, but the impression I get is we don't see Conan, training and like even like Luke Skywalker did. You don't necessarily have to show that. I mean, we don't see Achilles training, so, but there's a sense in which this is kind of deracinated too. So if we look at like the Iliad, even though there's this big war going on, most people, because it's an aristocratic warrior society, they seek duels of honor with other warriors.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like, it's not one guy versus 1,000. It's like one guy versus one guy, and they're just like dueling it out. Whereas like Conan is like one guy versus 1,000. That's just like, bro, it's not gonna happen. Sorry. I mean, if the one guy has a machine gun and the other guys have bows and arrows, maybe, but that's not what Conan is giving us. It's giving us these impossible odds that can actually in real life win.
I think that, yeah, exactly. I think that a lot of like modern, like just like absolutely empty-headed, like mass market product, young and old people can imbibe in it, like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, like Marvel DC, like cape stuff, like it's almost like very childish, stupid, like action hero logic, where it's like nothing can really beat them, so might as well let them fight amongst themselves. So it becomes like a video game. Thank you for listening to the Content Minded Podcast, where every Wednesday there are interesting guests, amazing ideas, solo streams, and discussions on a diverse array of topics from art, philosophy, history, and more. The free version will be available both here on YouTube and as a downloadable link on Anchor and Spotify, as well as on Substack. Each week, the full, uncensored, and spicier version will now be available on both Patreon and Substack, where you will have access to the full archive of both Content Minded and of Giant Reviews, where I break down interesting texts every week, including other exciting paywalled articles and good content. Thank you all. Please like, share, and subscribe. God bless. Goodbye. Help keep the content renaissance alive. Too sweet.